Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Sunday's study. We're going to go right ahead and get right into it. As you can see by the title, we are going to be discussing the Moabites. The Moabites are a significant group in Bible history. They are the descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew. Their history is very much intertwined with that of Israel and the surrounding nations. The Moabites trace their origins back to Lot's incestuous relationship with his eldest daughter after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot and his daughters took refuge in a cave nearby. This was after Lot's wife was turned to salt. His daughters, believing they were the last people on earth, made their father drunk and conceived children by him. The son of the eldest daughter was named Moab, and he became the father of the Moabite people. This incident is covered in Genesis chapter 19, verses 30 through 38. The Moabites and Israelites had a complex relationship, or even one could say relations. While they were family relatives through Lot, their relationship was often hostile. We see in Exodus, or the Exodus and the wilderness journey, when the Israelites were journeying to the promised land, they passed near the territory of Moab. The Moabites, led by their king Balak, feared the Israelites' strength and tried to curse them. Balak hired the prophet Balaam to curse Israel, but God intervened, and Balaam could only bless Israel in Numbers 22 and 24. The Moabites played a role in leading the Israelites into sin. They invited the Israelites to worship their gods and engage in immoral practices. This led to God's anger, and many Israelites were then punished. In the book of Judges, Eglon, the king of Moab, is mentioned as a significant antagonist. He oppressed the Israelites for 18 years before being defeated by the judge Ehud. Judges chapter 3, verses 12 to 30. Ehud, a left-handed man, secretly killed Eglon and delivered Israel from Moabite oppression. Side note, King David had interactions with the Moabites, both hostile and peaceful. Initially, David sought refuge with the Moabites when fleeing from King Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 22. Later, he fought against them. The Moabites were subdued, and David made them tributaries, though the Moabites were not completely destroyed. That was covered in 2 Samuel chapter 8 and 2 Samuel chapter 23. In the time of the prophets, Moab was often condemned for its pride and idolatry. The prophet Isaiah prophesied against Moab in Isaiah 15 and 16, declaring their downfall. Similarly, Jeremiah condemned Moab, predicting its defeat by Babylon in Jeremiah 48. One of the most significant Moabites in the Bible is Ruth, a Moabite woman who married an Israelite, Boaz, after her first husband's death. Ruth's story is told in the book of Ruth. Her faithfulness to her mother-in-law, Naomi, and her conversion to the God of Israel made her a remarkable figure. Ruth is also the great-grandmother of King David, making her an ancestor of Jesus Christ. Matthew chapter 1, verses 5. Her story highlights the inclusion of a foreigner into the lineage of Israel. Throughout the Bible, many prophets prophesied the fall of Moab, largely due to their pride, idolatry, and opposition to Israel. Notable prophecies would include the following three that I'm going to talk about. Isaiah 15:16, when it describes the mourning of Moab and their eventual downfall. And then Jeremiah 48, a detailed prophecy of Moab's destruction, including their cities and military forces. This chapter also highlights the sins of Moab and God's judgment upon them. In Ezekiel chapter 25, verses 8 and 11, or through 11, this is a prophecy against the Moabites, condemning them for rejoicing over Israel's misfortune. The Moabites are not as prominently featured in the New Testament, however, but their legacy endures through figures like Ruth. Ruth's inclusion in the genealogy of Jesus, and that serves as a testament to God's grace, as Moabites, once enemies of Israel, are now part of the story of salvation. The Moabites, being the descendants of Lot, had a long history of both conflict and connection with Israel. Though they started as a distant relative of Israel, their interactions were often marked by idolatry, conflict, and judgment. However, the story of Ruth shows the possibility of redemption and inclusion, even for those considered outsiders. Through prophetic writings, the Bible paints a picture of Moab as a nation that experienced both God's judgment and the hope of God's grace through individuals like Ruth. Moab is often the subject of prophetic judgments due to its pride, idolatry, and opposition to Israel. Several prophets would have spoken of it, but the major ones I'm going to include this evening are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. They deliver specific prophecies about Moab's downfall. These prophecies depict Moab's eventual destruction and serve as a warning against pride and rebellion. First, we have Isaiah's prophecy against Moab, which is covered in Isaiah 15 and 16. The prophet Isaiah pronounces a series of judgments against Moab in Isaiah chapters 15 and 16. This prophecy is an oracle against Moab, predicting its devastation and mourning. The key points would include the following four, one being the destruction and desolation. Isaiah begins by foretelling the destruction of Moab's cities, particularly Ar and Kir. The cities will be laid waste, and the people will be left to mourn. The chapter emphasizes the loss of life and the devastation that will befall the land. Second point here would be the mourning in Moab, covered in Isaiah 15, verse 5. The prophet laments that Moab will be filled with weeping and sorrow. This is due to the destruction that will come upon them, and even the people of Moab will cry out in despair. Third, we have the escape to Judah, which is covered in Isaiah chapter 16, verses 1 through 5. In response to Moab's devastation, Isaiah calls for Moab to seek refuge in Judah, as the Moabites may hope for relief from the people of Israel. This prophecy speaks of a time when Moab will look for help from Judah's king, symbolizing a desire for salvation. And the fourth point we'll cover here is the prophetic timing of God's judgment, or I should say, and God's judgment, which is covered in Isaiah chapter 16, verses 6 through 14. Moab's pride is condemned in this passage, and it is predicted that their pride will lead to their downfall. The prophecy also indicates that Moab's fate is already sealed, and the judgment will come swiftly and decisively. And now we get to Jeremiah. We get to Jeremiah's prophecy against Moab in Jeremiah 48. Jeremiah also delivers a comprehensive, rather extensive prophecy against Moab in Jeremiah 48, which details the reasons for Moab's judgment and the consequences they will face. We're going to look at 5 points in this particular passages from Jeremiah. One being Moab's pride and idolatry. In Jeremiah 48, verses 7 through 10, it talks about Moab's pride, self-sufficiency, and trust in its own strength are condemned. The Moabites are accused of relying on their own gods and their fortified cities rather than seeking the God of Israel. Second point we make here is the devastation of Moab. Jeremiah chapter 48, verse 11 through 20. Moab is described as having been at ease for a long time, like wine left on its lees, settled and unmoved. But now the judgment of God will cause Moab to be utterly shattered, and their cities will be destroyed, and the Moabites will flee in terror. Now, the third point we look at is God's anger, which is covered in 26-27. I should say verses 26 and 27. The Moabites are called drunkards, and their moral and spiritual decline is linked to their judgment. The Lord will bring his wrath upon them, making them a mockery among the nations. Now we get to the fourth point, destruction by Babylon, which is covered in verses 40 and 47, or 40 through 47, I should say. The prophecy points to the coming of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, who will invade Moab. The Moabites will be captured, and their cities will be razed. The entire nation will experience the fury of Babylon's military might. And then the fifth point, their final judgment, which is covered in verse 42. This final verse declares, Moab shall be destroyed from being a people, highlighting the complete devastation that will befall them, rendering them unrecognizable as a nation. And now we move to Ezekiel and his prophecy against Moab. The prophet Ezekiel includes Moab in his prophecy of judgment against the surrounding nations, which is covered specifically in Ezekiel chapter 25, verses 8 and 11. This is where Ezekiel condemns Moab for their arrogance and hostility towards Israel. I'm just going to look at 2 points here. One being Moab's contempt for Israel in chapter 25, verse 8. Moab is condemned for rejoicing when Israel was taken into captivity and for mocking them. Moab's pride led them to see Israel as weak and vulnerable, but they are warned that God will respond to their scorn. Now, the second point we look at here is God's judgment on Moab, which is covered in verses 9 through 11. Just as Moab rejoiced over Israel's downfall, they will experience their own defeat. God promises to send destruction upon Moab, including military conquests, and the land will become desolate like other nations. And like other nations, Moab will face God's judgment through foreign powers. And now we get to Zephaniah. Zephaniah's prophecies against Moab, which is covered in Zephaniah chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. The prophet Zephaniah also speaks against Moab, including them in a broader judgment against the nations that had opposed Israel. In Zephaniah chapter 2, verses 8 through 11, Moab is rebuked for its pride. 2 points we'll look at here is one being God's displeasure, verses 8 and 9. Moab is rebuked for their pride and arrogance, as I said before, and their land is described as being taken over by God's judgment. The nations around them will witness their downfall. The second point we'll make here is Moab's destruction, which is covered also in Zephaniah chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. Zephaniah prophesies. Zephaniah prophesies that Moab will be desolated, and the God of Israel will make it a wasteland. The Moabites will be left to face God's wrath, and foreign nations will come to witness this destruction. 2 other references to Moab's judgment is in both. One is in Amos and the other Malachi. Amos chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, the prophet Amos also speaks against Moab, condemning them for their violent actions against Edom and declaring that Moab will face judgment for their cruelty. Then in Malachi chapter 1, verses 2 through 5, well, not directly a prophecy against Moab. God uses the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, as a contrast to Israel, and some believe Moab's eventual destruction is tied to these broader judgments on neighboring nations, which I would wholeheartedly agree with that. There are 4 points I want to look at in Moab's prophecy here. Moab is consistently condemned for its pride, both in its military might and its spiritual idolatry. This pride led them to oppose Israel and to believe that they could stand against God's judgment. 2, we have the idolatry aspect of this. Moab's worship of false gods, particularly Chemosh, it's pronounced differently, is a reoccurring theme in the prophecies. This idolatry is seen as a major factor in their downfall. And then we look at God's power. The judgment on Moab serves to show God's power over all nations. Even though Moab was a relative of Israel, their rejection of God's ways led to their destruction. In some of the prophecies, there is a glimpse of restoration or a remnant. For instance, Isaiah chapter 16, verses 14, suggests that after Moab's judgment, there may be hope for its people if they seek refuge in Judah. Now, when we conclude in the prophecy part of this, the prophecies against Moab are clear, and they are a clear warning to the nations about the consequences of pride, idolatry, and hostility toward Israel. While Moab's judgment was certain, the scriptures also highlight that God, in his justice, will bring nations to account for their actions. Moab's eventual destruction serves as an example of the judgment that awaits all, even today, who reject God's ways and oppose his people. Next, I want to get into the religious festivals and the rituals and the tree worship aspect of the Moabs, or the Moabites. In the Bible, there are several references to religious festivals and rituals practiced by the Moabites, as well as their worship of trees, which were part of their idolatrous practices. The Moabites were known for their polytheistic beliefs and often worshipped deities like Chemosh, their primary god, and engaged in various rituals that were condemned by the prophets. So we're going to look at that now in different aspects of the Moabite worship. One, we look at the religious festivals and rituals of the Moabites. The Moabites, like other ancient cultures, had religious festivals and rituals associated with their worship of gods. These festivals were often tied to the seasons and agricultural cycles and fertility rites and military conquests. While the King James Bible does not always provide very specific details about the exact nature of these festivals, there are references to their practices and the significant festivals that involve sacrifices and idol worship. And just research in and by itself of those cultures in ancient times in those areas, we see what Jeremiah was talking about in chapter 9, verse 26, and chapter 10, looking at all these idolatry situations and worships and tree worship and all of these heathen ways. The chief god of the Moabites was Chemosh, a deity who was often associated with war and human sacrifice. Now, if I'm not pronouncing Chemosh correctly, I apologize. But I've heard it two different ways, so I'm just picking one. The Moabites believed Chemosh had power over fertility, victory in battle, and the forces of nature. The Bible describes Moab's devotion to Chemosh, particularly in the context of military struggles and the rituals associated with his worship. 2 Kings chapter 3, verses 26 and 27, one of the most notorious accounts involving Moabite religious practice or practices, is the story of King Mesha of Moab. During a battle against Israel, King Mesha, in a desperate attempt to gain favor from Chemosh, sacrificed his eldest son to the god. Not our God, not the God of Israel, but the God of the Moabites. The Bible recounts that when the Israelites saw this act, they withdrew from the battle in fear and disgust. He took his eldest son that should have reigned in his stead and offered him for a burnt offering upon the wall. And there was great indignation against Israel, and they departed from him and returned to their own land. This event suggests that the Moabites practiced human sacrifice, likely as a part of a larger religious ritual to appease their gods, little g, especially in times of war and or crisis. In keeping with the worship of Chemosh and other deities, the Moabite religious festivals may have, and did actually, involved fertility rites and ritual prostitution, similar to practices found in other ancient Near Eastern religions. These rites often involved acts of sexual immorality, believed to ensure fertility for both the land and the people. However, the Bible does, as we know, condemn such practices when Israel fell into idolatry, as they often involve violating God's judgment. In Numbers chapter 25, verses 1 through 3, during the Israelites' journey through the wilderness, the Moabites seduced the Israelites into idolatry and immorality. The Moabites invited the Israelites to their religious festivals, where they worshiped Baal Peor, a deity associated with fertility. This led to God's anger and a plague that killed many Israelites. And Israel abode in Shittim, and the people began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab. And they called the people unto the sacrifices of their gods, and the people did eat and bow down to their gods, including Baal and Chemosh. Now we look at the tree worship in Moab. Tree worship was a common practice in many ancient cultures, including the Moabites. Trees were often associated with fertility, life, and the presence of divine power. In the Bible, tree worship is frequently condemned as a form of idolatry. The Moabites, like many other nations, were known to engage in such practices. The Moabites had sacred high places and altars, often located on hilltops where they would worship their gods. These high places frequently featured trees or groves that were considered sacred to their gods and were used as a place for offerings and rituals. 1 Kings 14:23, this verse mentions the practice of setting up groves or high places, which were often associated with the worship of pagan gods. Now, if you think about groves, you think they're rows of trees that people grow for specific reasons. Although this passage does not explicitly mention Moab, it highlights a common practice among pagan nations, including Moab, of using trees in their religious religious rituals. But they also built them in high places and images and groves on every high hill and under every green tree. These groves, or Asherah poles, were often used in rituals dedicated to fertility gods. While these practices were widespread in the ancient world, they were an abomination to the Israelites and were frequently condemned by the prophets. The Moabites, like their neighbors, were prone to worshiping trees and natural elements as divine manifestations. The Bible sometimes associates tree worship with the worship of Asherah, the Canaanite goddess of fertility, who was often symbolized by sacred trees or wooden poles. Some often think it's just wooden poles, but it's both sacred trees and wooden poles. Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 21. While this verse does not specifically mention Moab, it condemns the practice of planting a tree or setting up a tree or setting up an Asherah pole as an act of idolatry in the worship of false gods. Thou shalt not plant thee a grove of any trees near unto the altar of the Lord thy God, which thou shalt make thee. The Moabites are likely to have engaged in these similar practices just like the others of that time frame. Considering their idolatrous history, the trees and groves were viewed as sites of sacred worship, dedicated to deities like Chemosh or Baal, and were a form of worship that directly contradicted the worship of the one true God. The prophets frequently denounced Moabite religious practices, including their involvement in idol worship, human sacrifice, and tree worship. The Moabites' adherence to these rituals was a significant part of their spiritual rebellion against God. In Jeremiah 48:7, Jeremiah prophesied that Moab's trust in their gods, including their reliance on I always get those two words religious rituals, will lead to their downfall. For because thou hast trusted in thy works and in thy treasures, thou shalt also be taken, and Chemosh shall go forth into captivity with his priests and his princes together. In Ezekiel chapter 25, verse 9, Ezekiel spoke against the Moabites' arrogance and their contempt for Israel, condemning their reliance on false gods. Therefore, behold, I will open the side of Moab from his cities which are on his frontiers, the glory of the country, Beth Jeshemoth, Baal-meon, and Kiriathaim. We're going to conclude here. I just want to finish by saying the Moabites practice religious festivals and religious rituals that were deeply rooted in idolatry, including the worship of Chemosh, the god of war and fertility, as well as other deities like Baal. These festivals often included and involved acts such as human sacrifice, fertility rites, and ritual prostitution. Tree worship, associated with sacred groves of Asherah poles, was also a key part of their religious practices. The Bible consistently condemns these practices as they were seen as abominable to God. The Moabites' idolatry and reliance on false gods were major reasons for their eventual downfall and judgment. The Israelites were often warned not to adopt such practices, and the prophets, including Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, spoke vehemently against Moab's idolatrous ways. Through these condemnations, The Bible underscores the importance of worshiping the one true God and rejecting the idolatrous practices that were common in the ancient world. Thank you for your time. I appreciate you tuning in this evening. I hope some of this was helpful and you've learned or gleaned a little from it. With that, God bless and good day.